Happily. Heavenly Father, we come to you through Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit. Thank you for the connections that we have, the unity and connectivity we have in you, Lord, across the miles. Thank you for all you have done for us, and pull us into that more fully in these conversations and re-schematize our minds and reboot us where we need it, clarify us where we need it, and draw us deeper into your life. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, we ask in your grace. And thank you for Tom and Marty and these amazing guys and folks we get to be with here today in this sweet fellowship. Be with those who aren't with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. So today is the first day of beginning our investigation of this book, Thomas F. Torrance and Evangelical Theology, a Critical Analysis, edited by Mike and Lucas, with a foreword by Fred. I don't know if we can get Fred to come on or not, but that could be interesting as well to get a perspective on what it is that he thinks about it. With endnotes and everything, there's 348 pages in the book. And in terms of chapters, there are 14 chapters. So we have the opportunity, if we can get everyone, for at least 14 chapters to discuss what it is that T.F. Torrance and Evangelical Theology will add to a broad conversation. I have probably a third of a shelf on Karl Barth and Evangelical Theology. So there's a long history of engaging this question: why in the world would evangelicals find a particular value in the work of Torrance and Barth? And so this is really the first contribution I'm aware of. Tom, are you aware of any other contributions to the question of Torrance and evangelical thought, either in its British sense or its American sense?
On the British end, yes, there's this little book that I edited, British Evangelical Theologians of the 20th Century.
Okay.
That's IVP London publication. They now publish, they're part of SPCK, which is the Anglican publisher. So this is Apollos. You'll know that imprint, Apollos. And when was this published? Last year? Yes, 2022.
And you have a chapter on T.F. Torrance in there?
Yes. It's a representative selection. And in a way, I suppose you could say this is kind of defining what in Britain is understood as the evangelical tradition. So let me just give you the names of the 12 theologians in it.
Yeah, the 12 disciples?
Yeah, 12 disciples, yeah, that's right. Yeah. James R., James Denny, P.T. Forsyth, W.H. Griffith Thomas, not so well known, but he was principal of Wycliffe, and then went to Canada and then the States. H.R. McIntosh, we know. W.E. Sangster, representing the Methodist tradition. Is that name known to you?
Don't know him.
Not a leading theologian, but an outstanding preacher. He was the Methodist minister of Westminster Central Hall during the Blitz, had congregations of thousands, was a very prominent figure in British life until he died in 1960. That's W.E. Sangster. Martin Lloyd-Jones is a name you will know.
I know that.
John R.W. Stott, of course you will know. James I. Packer, Thomas F. Torrance, Leslie Newbigin, Colin Gunton. That's the 12 that we chose to represent the tradition. And the point we're making is that it's a wider tradition than some people would have us believe.
Yeah. So James Stewart you don't have in there, which J.B. Torrance recommended as our reading on Paul and all that, a man in Christ, that he was one of the best, preachers, but theologians really as well.
Well, this is theologians as distinct from biblical scholars.
Okay.
So if it had been New Testament scholars, well, one would have had Stewart, one would have F.F. Bruce, etc. And it's limited to the 20th century. So
Okay.
we stop there. So other
Yeah.
names might not
Right.
are really publishing in the
So
21st century.
with that 12, can you give a summarial statement on the distinctives of British evangelical theology? And if you want, you can throw in as in distinction from American. And I don't know if you know enough about the Australian and New Zealand evangelical forms of theology to distinguish there. We have those people with us today, both Australia and New Zealand. So
Right.
identify
Well,
and distinguish.
I think that would be largely similar, the UK,
Uh-huh.
Australia, and New Zealand.
Mhm.
And the way my chapter in this book is also defining what we mean by that in the British context. Well,
Yeah.
the historian Bebbington, David Bebbington, famously came up with his quadrilateral crucicentrism, biblicism, what are the other two? Conversionism, right, and activism.
Mhm.
Now, that's a fairly broad, and it's not satisfactory from the theologian's point of view. It's a useful checklist from the historian's point of view. But all of those 12 that we have there in this book could be included within that. One of the things which my chapter that we're discussing tonight traces is the way in which in the mid-20th century, there was an influence on the British scene from the States, namely that Martin Lloyd-Jones was influenced by the Warfield tradition. And so there was a tendency for intervarsity to narrow its scope to the Warfield tradition. And James Packer is the particular representative of that, the way that went. And it was that development in the post-war period which led to the parting of the ways, as I call it in this chapter, between the Torrance brothers and the intervarsity tradition. I have been involved in both of these traditions. I mean, I wrote the history of Tyndale House. I still serve with the Tyndale Fellowship, chair their doctrine commission, and David Wright, who was professor of history, church history at New College, Edinburgh, and one of my own teachers, I worked with him for some years in that. And I only learned recently from David Ferguson, I think it was, that David Wright was very interested in bringing these two traditions together again, the Torrance tradition and the IVP intervarsity tradition. So in a way, that's what I've been doing in this book.
Yeah. So IVP has come full circle, is what you're telling me, and you have been part of the rejoining of lost brethren.
Yes.
And-
Yes. I think that is fair comment.
Yeah. Are there any
If I
females?
may.
I partly asked for Jenny, just to we get the question now, then you can ask yours. Are there any females in the 20th century who would be worthy of being on the list?
No, and I commented that in my introduction.
Yeah.
That from our perspective today, that is one of the things that strike us.
Yeah.
And I could mention two women who became principals of Anglican theological colleges right at the end of the 20th century. Ruth Etchells in Durham and Tina, what's her name, in St. John's, Durham. So, but not major theologians, and that's one of the big developments, I think.
Janet Martin Soskus?
Pardon?
Janet Martin Soskus, would she be considered?
I don't think she would be identify herself with this tradition.
Okay, with this tradition, that's
No,
fair enough. Okay.
Yes.
She's
Yes.
more of a
Okay.
philosophical theologian.
In a
Yes.
sense, it's true. Yeah, it's where one draws the lines. That's true. Brian, go
Yes.
ahead and ask your question there.
I think, and I'm sure Tom knows the story very well, that John Stott, Martin Lloyd-Jones, 1968, parting of the ways,
Yes.
because there's an ecclesiological context to all of this.
Yes.
There are Christian communities involved, not just
Right.
abstract ideas and stuff.
Yes.
And I think when evangelical Anglicans stayed within the Church of England
Yes.
and that famous Kiel Conference of 1968.
Yes.
That sees a watershed. The Lausanne movement sees a watershed right through. It's fascinating to
Right.
see the way that evangelicals tried to stay within the Church of England. Have they succeeded? 2023, I mean, you know, you look at Lambeth 2022 and you have to quietly go, well, it was a noble effort. Because have they stemmed the institutional tide? Well, I'm not sure they have.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting comment. Now, the division between Lloyd Jones and Stott was at an assembly of the Evangelical Alliance in London. It was a little earlier than 68. I'm trying to think of the exact date. I think it was something like 65 or 66. The Kiel Conference came later. That was for Anglican.
Yeah, 68.
But just to tell the story very briefly, at that meeting of the Evangelical Alliance, Lloyd Jones was asked to give the opening address. And he appeared to be appealing to evangelicals in the Church of England to leave the Church of England and to join with non-conformist evangelicals, Congregationalists like himself, and so on, in a separate evangelical denomination. But John Stott was chairing that meeting. And at the end, he stood up and for 10 minutes totally disagreed with Lloyd Jones because he feared that lots of young ordinands in the Church of England would leave. And so that led to a parting of the ways. Lloyd Jones, of course, represented a distinct tradition of Welsh Calvinistic Methodism. So the more clearly reformed people tended to gather around him. But that left James Packer within the Church of England, and the more reformed wing became less influential. Stott was a broader figure who sort of unified a number of different traditions as evangelical within the Church of England. Now, as to the present situation, I think the Evangelical Council, the Church of England Evangelical Council, is actually very strongly represented on the current synod, and the sort of impasse on the issue of marriage, which became clear a few months ago, indicates that the Evangelical Council has about 40% of the members of the General Synod of the Church of England.
Yeah.
So that's something that's still to resolve. However, we're going off at a bit of a tangent here.
A little bit, but not much. I mean, the question that's come to my mind, what is the nerve, in a sense? I mean, to say T.F. Torrance was a missionary-hearted person, and so the nature of people coming to really know the person of Christ was significant for him. To say that there are others who seem to have a sense of doctrine and the issue of conforming to, you know, whether it's the Westminster Confession or something like that. So, you know, what held them together, and why would those sensibilities divide them, in a sense?
Sorry, what are we talking about now?
The nature of the tradition that follows Torrance, the missionary, and Lloyd Jones seem to take, you know, following the Westminster Confession and Westminster Theological Seminary, this sense that doctrine was to be defended. And so the separation, and again, I don't know the issues of leaving the Anglican Church, but it would seem that there is some sense, as I read your chapter, that the nature of, to say one had a missionary heart and the other had a sense of true to the teachings of the church heart. And the question, why do they need to divide? And, you know, is there a core in there that that is part of the hope for the revival that you see, in a sense, the coming back together happening?
Well, I'm not sure that entirely characterizes the situation. I mean, one of the things I was trying to demonstrate in the early pages of my chapter was the way in which the modern missionary movement emerged in the 19th century out of the 18th century evangelical revival. And one of the reasons I went into that was because the Torrance family was a missionary family. And so this was one developing tradition, the evangelical revival of the 18th century, developing into the missionary work of the 19th century. Kenneth Scott Laturette's point about it being the great age of missionary expansion. So there was a cross-denominational element in that in the 19th century. And but it was essentially the evangelical churches that sent missionaries abroad. And in the Scottish situation, when the evangelical wing came out of the Church of Scotland in 1843 to form the Free Church, all of the missionaries of the Church of Scotland went with them, indicating that it was the evangelical tradition which was the missionary tradition. And so in the late 19th century, the development of faith missions, including the China Inland Mission, Hudson Taylor and so on, and it was with them that the Torrance's father, Thomas Torrance Sr., went to China, although he later switched to the American Bible Society. So my point in the early part of my chapter was to make the point that Torrance was rooted in the Torrance family was rooted in this evangelical stroke missionary tradition. Now, the question you raised there, Marty, about how the doctrinal side to that, in a way, that's an interesting point, because as I said, the 19th century missionary movement was a cross-denominational movement. I mean, the later ecumenical movement of the 20th century was rooted in that cross-denominational, cross-traditional. So Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, evangelicalism was a cross-denominational movement, and the missionary movement was too. So by the end of the 19th century, the fact that the evangelical movement was facing critical intellectual issues with the rise of liberalism and so on, meant that as you come into the 20th century, it's battling for its life against the liberal tradition, the Richelianism, and so there's a kind of defensive mindset developed in the evangelical tradition, which is why there was such a suspicion when Torrance seemed to adopt a Bartian position. And that was really what led to I mean, there was a great fear in the evangelical tradition of slipping from the faith. The sense that liberalism had dominated in the theological colleges. Young men going into the ministry were losing their evangelical faith. And so, but the Torrance family were part of the student volunteer movement right back from the 1880s, 1890s, which was less theological, I would say. But the theological issues that developed at the beginning of the 20th century led to intervarsity splitting from the student volunteer movement and forming a separate. Now, the Torrances tried to keep those two together, as did Leslie Newbigin. So Torrance tried to be involved in both the SCM, Student Christian Movement, and InterVarsity. And then, of course, it was his mother who gave him a copy of Credo, and so indicated that Bart was all right. And Torrance followed that up by going and studying with Bart. But that was what caused the suspicion in traditional evangelical minds, because to them, Bart was another representative of this liberalism that had done such damage. And of course, Van Til's book against Spartanism and the Westminster tradition of the Westminster Theological Seminary
Yeah.
increased that suspicion in evangelical minds. Now, I think that was tragic, actually. I think that Geoffrey Bromley, yes, Cornelius, exactly, Karl Barth and evangelicalism and the new modernism, that was his damaging title of one of his early books, Van Til. Yep, there it is. But yes, the way he dealt with that. So, I mean, I think that did a lot of damage, and it helped to create the suspicion.
Yeah. Well, the question of what is meant by faith, slipping from the faith, for Torrance, there was a sense, even as a missionary to theologians, that they were slipping from what he saw as the vital faith that Bart presented of hearing the voice of the living Christ and being led by the Spirit. The question of people like Van Til and Machen and others who left, to what degree they felt the faith was condensed into statements, the whole sense of Carl F. Henry's rational kind of Christianity. So that the very meaning of the word faith within the evangelical circle was at some level at stake, and maybe still is, and maybe that's coming back. And the whole question that you've raised of the degree to which youth movements really were part of the shaping of much of this. Today there are youth movements, but not at they're more evangelistic rather than really shaping, the life of a thinking community of the church in a way that becomes hugely impactful. And so anyway, do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Yes, it's interesting thinking about, I talked earlier about the role of Lloyd Jones in the way British evangelicalism developed, and the fact that he introduced the thinking of Warfield. And you can see how that influences people like James Packer and so on. But I think you have to say that on this point, Lloyd Jones and Torrance and Packer were actually on the same side, namely that they wanted serious evangelical theology. And Lloyd Jones was very critical of the non-intellectual character of Anglican evangelicalism in the early 20th century. So in a way, while Lloyd Jones was influenced by the Warfield tradition, both the Warfield tradition and the tradition of James Orr, which was different in the Scottish context, both regarded theology as vital, as important to the mission of the church. So in a sense, the importance of theology for the Reformed tradition was something that the Lloyd Jones school, influenced by Warfield, and the Torrance school, coming from Orr and Denny and Mackintosh, had in common.
Right. Of course, I had J.A. Packer just north of me here at Regent College, and I was there for a year and a half as a postdoctoral fellow. So he was an interesting figure. I mean, the nature of what he spoke and what he said, he was highly dignified. I didn't see in him I didn't see the same impact as I saw with T.F. Torrance, a broad sense of people engaging and seeing a way forward to do better theology in a sense. So he was revered as an individual. I don't know that there will be a Packer school that comes from him.
That's an interesting question. The chapter on Packer in this book was written by a former PhD student of mine who did his thesis on Packer.
Okay.
Don Payne of Denver Seminary. And he, as a North American, is very much aware of the impact that Packer has had on the North American scene. I have detected that it's sometimes a surprise to people in North America to learn that Packer had a previous life in England, and
Yes,
it was significant
we don't
in the
know.
50s and 60s.
Hmm.
One of his significant books, actually, in the 1950s, InterVarsity was spreading in the universities. The Billy Graham Crusades were happening in London 1954, Glasgow 1955, and there was a reaction against what was called fundamentalism.
Right.
So InterVarsity and Billy Graham were regarded as fundamentalists. That name was pinned on them.
Hmm.
So Packer in 58 published with IVP his little book, Fundamentalism and the Word of God. Now, it's very important to read in that title that he puts quotes round the word fundamentalism. In other words, he's
Right.
not defending fundamentalism. What he's saying is this theological swear word, if you like, is being used to attack what is essentially the evangelical Reformation Christian tradition. And so he was very, it was a kind of evangelical manifesto of 1958, which was very significant. But it was very much took the line of emphasizing biblical authority. So it wasn't that he emphasized the Christ-centeredness of evangelical tradition. It was the biblical authority. It was a kind of rationalist approach, actually, from the Warfield school.
Right. Well, that's an important distinction there to make. And it's part of the question I was asking earlier, I guess, the battle over the nature of the Bible and how we regard what gives the Bible authority, and the whole nature of, well, I mean, the question of election comes up along the way too. And, James Torrance standing against, at some level, all of the forms of Westminster Confession, federal Calvinism, he called it, which I think TF would have been aligned with that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, I mean, the issue of how we understand the authority of the Bible and the nature of election became two theological points.
Yes.
The point of the theological point, in a sense, and this is where the book that Packer wrote, Knowing God, was one of the first books that I read of Packer's. And in a sense, it does have what I would call the more personal sense that Torrance writes in.
Oh, it does. Yes.
So,
I would say that's his finest book, Knowing God.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's very, very helpful book. Yes.
Yeah.
And his fundamentalism of the Word of God was quite good as a declaration of what differentiated evangelical Christianity from the liberal tradition and from the Catholic position. So, I mean, essentially, his point was evangelicals make the Bible their final authority. Liberalism makes the intellect or experience of the individual its final authority. Catholicism makes tradition its final authority. And as an initial analysis, that's not bad. I mean, I would say fundamentally right. Although he doesn't allow for the importance of tradition and experience and reason in the evangelical tradition.
I see Bryden has his hand up there. Let's go ahead and see what you got, Bryden.
Thank you so much, Tom. I think this historical perspective is terribly helpful. And I would go a bit beyond that lovely book, Fundamentalism, in quotes. His book, God Has Spoken, is very helpful.
Yes.
And then, of course, as things morphed in the 1970s, you have fundamentalism, James Barr, all that stuff.
Yes,
and he says, beyond the battle of the Bible is, I think, a very helpful, dare I use the phrase, mediating position between North Americans and the Brits. And of course, that's when Packer shifts geographically.
Yes.
And I think that there is a real tension in that development of those three books. Fundamentalism, God Has Spoken, Beyond the Battle of the Bible. Because we're dealing with two brands now of fundamentalism, evangelicalism, etc.
Right. That's very, very good. Yes, that's very true.
Yeah, it's again, it's history, it's development.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Bryden. That's good. The question of missionary, which, I mean, you begin your chapter, Evangelical Missions, and you, as you've commented, Kenneth Scott Latorette's 19th century definition, the Great Century, the question of Torrance, who even would, I mean, he did have a sense of going to China, and as Bryden pointed out, when he retired, he went back to China. I mean, there was an orienting sense where his heart was, so to speak, that was there. But he also had this heart to see theologians converted as well. I mean, he would say, I'm a missionary, first of all, in a sense, to the academy.
Yes.
Right. And so what was his vision as a missionary to the academy, born out of his years in China?
Well, I think it was H.R. Mackintosh who persuaded him that there was a role for him. And that in addition to the mission to those completely beyond the church, that there was a mission to those brought up in a Christian culture. In a way, I suppose you could compare it with Wesley's concern in the 18th century, that so many folks within the fold of the Christian church did not actually have a living personal faith. And so I think similarly, Torrance was aware that there were lots of people in a widespread nominal Christianity in the Britain of the early 20th century who actually had no living faith in Christ, no personal communion with Christ, no sense of the presence of the Spirit. And some of those would offer themselves for the ministry, and of course the way in which the liberal theology of the early 20th century presented the Christian faith, and the emphasis on religion and religious life, that Torrance felt that there was a real task to be done there, and he would occasionally sometimes annoy students by saying, well, you won't understand that till you're born again. which they tended to be offended about, but he would say such things from time to time.
Because for them it was a formality that they hadn't, in a sense, committed themselves to. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that was his sense, and of course, he as a student himself, he was involved in both InterVarsity and SCM, and both of these groups held frequent missions to the university. In fact, when he was in Oxford in the early 1940s, when he couldn't go back to Basel, he was invited to conduct a mission to the university. So that was very much part of both of those groups. Both of those you might characterize as the conservative evangelicals, and those in the SCM you might characterize as liberal evangelicals.
Right. And the question, to what degree was T.F. Torrance's interest in science part of his evangelizing to find a language through Polanyi and others, to find a language that would allow for a transformation of framework of thought that would evangelize the contemporary university?
Yes, no, that's an interesting point. Of course, it was the other significant professor at New College who influenced him in that respect. His name has just gone from me, but the link between theology and science. And curiously, why did Tom Torrance take up that issue? I cannot escape from the idea that there was something of an apologetic motive there.
Right.
That this was an area where there was said to be conflict between Christianity and science, and he was interested in this because of the intellectual issues that it raised, but because in the atmosphere of the early 20th century, this had become one of the big issues.
Yeah.
Old-fashioned religion versus modern go-ahead science. And so to
Yeah.
take up that issue at the deeper level at which Torrance took it up, the methodological level, you can see as an apologetic move.
The fifth book in the series of the Theology and Science, the Frontiers of Knowledge, is written by an Australian, Mitchell, who's quite overt right in his opening statements that this is more apologetic than any of the other books in this series.
Yes.
And there is a
Yes.
sense, and he's using Einstein as part of that apologetic, but
Yes.
I think it is clear that there is that dimension, and that Torrance included him in that series because of this capacity to reason with the modern mind in a way that Einstein was opening up, and
Yes.
that was important. But again, to see it really from the heart of mission, rather than him just being a defender of a particular kind of rationality, in the tradition of some of these others we've talked about.
Yes. Yes. Daniel Lamont was the other professor at your college whose name is eluded me for a moment.
Right.
He was Christ and the World of Thought was his published book. And Lamont, I think, was the one who sparked this interest in Torrance.
Is that the only book that he wrote? I do have that.
As far as I know, it's the only book he wrote. Yes.
And I haven't found much on him. I mean, he didn't leave a cadre of people who are writing about him. Torrance would be a dominant kind of mode. Yeah. We'll go through that book at some point along the way in our reading group, just to see roots of T.F. Torrance in Daniel's there. There are a couple of comments.
The whole topic's so interesting to Torrance that, of course, he wanted to write his doctoral thesis on that, but Bart wouldn't let him.
Right, wouldn't let him.
Thought he was too young.
That says something, that Torrance wanted to do that. Bart didn't, though Bart uses the language of science. I mean, the opening statement of the dogmatics, Christian dogmatics, is the church's scientific self-examination, its distinctive talk about God. I mean, he's aware of the nature of science as a conversation partner. It seems that is not to be avoided, and yet he didn't want Torrance to go there yet.
Right. That was a comment there from Jenny Richards.
Well, we have a number of comments going on here.
Yeah.
Let's see. Jenny asked about, she said that the UK, Australia, New Zealand have more in common than with the USA, and I think you affirmed that. Bryden noted that when he retired, he went back to China. Bryden commented on personal revelation versus propositional, which is still a big problem in the United States, the whole nature of propositional kind of theology. Bryden mentions what Berkauer is the triumph of grace. Is that what you're referring to, Bryden? Yep.
Yes, it
Todd
is.
mentioned, yeah. The New Frontier is a four-part Calvinist, small, worldwide UK-based charismatic church planting movement, maintains a veneration solely of Martin Lloyd-Jones. So apparently there's an influence in the UK still for Martin Lloyd-Jones.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
However, after that split in the 1960s, he set up what he called the Evangelical Council, and he became the leading figure in the FIEC, the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches. Now, that is still active in this country, and there tend to be two wings, a more charismatic wing and a more Calvinist wing. But Lloyd-Jones was the leading figure in setting that up.
And would Tom Smale fit into any of that?
No. Smale, of course, studied with Torrance, and then I'm not sure at what point he became an Anglican. I'm not sure about Tom Smale's early life, whether he started in the Church of Scotland. I'm not sure about that. But he certainly was involved in the Anglican charismatic revival of the 1960s.
Yeah.
And then I think because of his theological education in Torrance, he began to think a little more critically about that.
Yeah, he did. My essay and the soon to come out Participatios on T.F. Torrance and Tom Smale, specifically on their theology and not as much their history, other than to note the correlation, and then the work that he went on to do in the books that he wrote, and the way he played out in a way that that Torrance didn't into the charismatic conversation. So
Yes.
it's trying to
Yes.
build and expand. Todd says, did James Torrance reminisce in one of his public extemporaneous debates with Packer in England, perhaps regarding Calvin propounding limited atonement less than many modern Calvinists assumed? Todd, you may want to clarify the question there if you're. Are you there, Todd? If he comes in,
I'm sorry.
Oh, go.
Sorry, stumbling here over obstacles. And I just remember some audio I heard of JBT, and I think he was talking about maybe when he was a student in England for a year, perhaps at Oxford, and maybe Packer was there at the same time, and they were quite young, and there was some sort of public gathering, and I thought they had a back and forth, and I thought it was about limited atonement, and that James Torrance thought he sort of got the better of Packer, and I think, yeah, that I just have a faint memory of that, and I was wondering if maybe somebody had a comment on that.
I
Which
think, Todd, you may be referring to the debate in the Tyndale Fellowship in 1950. Now, by that time, they were both graduates and engaged in further study. And the Tyndale Fellowship decided to have a conference on the plan of salvation, by which was meant the 5 points of Calvinism, tulip. So I cover that in this chapter a little bit, and also in my history of Tyndale House. James Torrance has been asked to speak on unconditional election, but the real debate came over the issue of limited atonement. John Murray of Westminster Theological Seminary, a Scot, was there, tried to make an exegetical case, lost. But Jim Packer came in on the side of logic. So you logically had to go either for universalism or limited atonement. And so he argued for limited atonement that way. But
where does one stand for that logic? I mean, logic occurs a human point of view, kind of. I mean,
yes. Lloyd Jones was chairing that debate, and James Torrance ever afterwards was a warrior against scholastic federal Calvinism, as he called it.
yes.
And I was just listening to this lecture yesterday from the James Torrance Regent collection, which is sacramental. It's just awesome, you know.
Yeah.
And he recounted that debate. It's in lecture D for delightful, because I remember I love the exchange he has on this, and he recounted that very moment.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, he went after, he challenged Murray, said Murray couldn't find any chapter in Calvin that affirmed limited atonement.
Yeah.
But then Packer said, you know, as he said, put me through my paces, and said either you're universalism and limited atonement. And what James Torrance told his students in that group, he said, there's a time to plead the fifth, you know, in theology, and he sort of appealed to mystery, you know, which was interesting, and then affirmed, you know, the positives of the gospel, you know. So anyway, it's wonderful. And then someone asked him about Packer in that lecture, and then JBT said, "Oh, you were very naughty to ask me that," you know, because I guess Packer was still there at the time, and you know, he was being very careful, you know, about that. So anyway, it's a wonderful exchange. But yeah, you can hear everything you're saying in that dialogue.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
everything there.
When I was writing the history of Tyndale House and Tyndale Fellowship, I wrote to various people who'd been involved in that debate, and I have a lovely 2-page handwritten letter from JP in which he gives his side of the story, what happened in that.
Wow. That'll go to a museum someday, I hope. A Torrance museum
Oh yes,
or something. So Jenny, you made a comment here. Do you want to speak to the the I don't recall statement.
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone, and hi, Tom. Fantastic to be here today. I've finished my breakfast, so I've turned my camera on now. Ironically, I'm with Matthew. I was listening to JB in the car driving home last night. Not the same lecture, but a similar one, and it reminded me of a time, and it was much later. One of his lecture tours in Jackson that he did in the 90s. When he was talking about, JB was talking about a time where, and I mean, this is not my field, so I don't know the names of all of the organisations, but there was an international Calvin symposium that was kind of by invitation only, and he was giving a keynote. And as the keynote, the title was something like, Calvin was not a federal theologian. You know, just for something that's nice and gentle and not controversial, and apparently, and he made his case for that, and he said that, you know, of all of the people there, he didn't encounter, like, there wasn't anyone who wound up you know, trying to put a different view. They all understood the lines that he was drawing there, and precisely why, I suppose, it's not actually that question between limited atonement and universalism, but that, you know, there is another way, and I wonder whether we don't pay attention to that enough. And I don't know enough about all of these things to speak too much to your question, Marty, earlier about, you know, the differences between the US position and the Australian position, or UK, or New Zealand. But I suspect, as I guess something of an outsider looking in, I suspect that the link between you know, theology or church and politics plays quite a role as well, because I think here, that whole thing about people are slipping in their faith, whatever that means, and the fear that engenders sometimes within churches, and probably within evangelical churches as well. It gets expressed in a way that appears reactionary, and everybody's grasping and trying to get people back to church, or whatever that means. And for people who are not church attenders, here at least it comes across, I don't think we do it well, and it comes across as a grasping for influence in society, and a grasping for political power and things like that. Because it's sort of a call to get everybody back to the old ways, or the old beliefs, or things like that. And I think there are probably differences in that within the different countries, partly because of the place of the church in society, and you know, political underpinnings and things like that. I think you know, the US has a sense of Christianity being part of its founding identity because of the way that it was established, that Australia doesn't have, and that New Zealand doesn't have, and that the UK doesn't have. I don't know much more, couldn't speak much more to it than that. But you know, church and state are not as involved or connected in that sort of fundamental identity way. So in Australia, if people are, you know, leaving the church or moving away from the Christian beliefs or whatever, people don't look at that as being un-Australian, for example. And we have a very strong faith contingent in terms of our First Nations populations as well, and things like that sort of play into that. So the question of what an evangelical even is, and what we mean by evangelical, and whether or not evangelical is becoming, you know, a misunderstood term, or a very loaded term. We don't have that as much in Australia as there might be in other places. I'm not sure. But I know for myself the distinction between a biblical scholar and a theologian, or, you know, someone who's evangelical versus someone who's not. A lot of people don't even understand what those terms are really trying to imply now. And I think, I guess for younger generations, I'm a younger generation, you know, who knows?
You're pretty young.
there's less of a sense of wanting to identify within a particular faith tradition than there was previously, and
Right.
a lot of people want to have an allegiance that is, just to Jesus or just to following, or people will say they're a follower of Jesus rather than a Christian, if that's a loaded word. I think there are some of those kinds of things, and so for me, some of that means that people think that the historical, information about how all of these things unfolded, is less important. I don't think it is less important, because if we don't know where we came from, we don't know where we're going. And particularly for things like a question of limited atonement versus universalism, if you don't know where you've come from, you won't know how to approach that question or understand why the difference between those things is so important. And it's very easy to write off someone's arguments when, all you're listening to is sound bites about stuff, and you're not going deeper. And one of the reasons that I'm really, particularly as someone who, I hesitate to say that I'm outside the theological tradition, because Bart, of course, would say, if you think about God, you're a theologian. But, I'm not trained within this tradition, and it's not my primary area. But one of the reasons that I value this book so much, the new book, the edition that we're speaking of with your chapter, Tom, and it's so helpful, is because it's trying to contextualize why all of this is so important for ministry on the ground and for what's happening every day in churches. And we can't separate these things out and just say that the academy is only for the academy. So it's very, very helpful. I feel like I've said 10 things in one. I don't know whether that addresses your question, Marty.
Yes, well, you did, and that's good. And also, just to note, you do have a chapter in this book as well, and we will be having a conversation with you about that.
Yeah, that's chapter 12. We can get to that later. That's fine.
Yeah, I don't have to do them in sequence.
Hopefully I'll have finished my thesis by then.
Yes, well, you finished this chapter, so that's important. I want to say one thing and then go to Matthew, and that is the question. We'll have Bryden answer this when we come back. New Zealand has two parts to it. The South Island has a part that's Anglican, which Christchurch maybe is the center of that, and the South, Dunedin, is the Gaelic form of Edinburgh, because it's the Presbyterian Church owns the south end of the island. So I'm going to have Matthew ask his question, then Bryden, I'll come back to you and have a comment on Jenny's comment that there may not be a religious orientation, but I'm thinking there may be in the South Island, not as much in the North Island. But Matt, I'm going to go, I saw your hand up there. I'm going to go to you, and then Bryden, I'll come to you.
Thanks. Just a comment about the intervarsity connection and that tension with intervarsity. I was involved with intervarsity in college, and then I later came on staff with intervarsity. And I saw, when I was in school in the early 90s, my staff worker was very much a Van Til, Westminster Seminary, evangelical rationalist kind of guy, brilliant Hopkins grad, but you could hear a lot of fear-based protection of theology in it, not completely unfounded, but definitely going in a direction versus the church I grew up in, which is a local big Presbyterian church, which really was, whether the pastors knew it or not, I think more Bartian, more Torrancean in how they articulated their faith, So that was challenging for me. And then I went to Urbana and I heard Steve Hayner. And I went, wait, this is a different intervarsity. You know what I mean? I felt like he was a little bit different. And then I came on staff in the intervarsity, and then I was in seminary, and I had Gary Detto, who was with InterVarsity staff, grad student at InterVarsity, with InterVarsity at Princeton University. And that was a different InterVarsity. So that's an interesting little case study in how even all of these dynamics are in play within IV. But the visceral, the vibe of my staff worker, where I started with in college, and that dynamic versus, what I came to in Gary, kind of very different worlds. I mean, not that they're all Christians, but I'm just saying it's exactly what you're describing historically, but in the topography that you've laid out.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see it all in the context of who is T.F. Torrance in the midst of all these conversations, and how do different people receive him and resist him and all that. That's all wrapped up in this story. Bryden, I'm going to go to the question of the South Island and the formation of the culture of the South Island, whether or not there was a religious dimension built in.
Very quickly, New Zealand currently is about 5 million people. 1 million of whom live in the South Island. That's the first dynamic.
Yep.
The South Island is profoundly agricultural. Yes, we have two main centres. We have Christchurch, which is 340,000, Environs another 100,000 perhaps. So, you know, it's a huge centre of gravity. Dunedin, yes, is Scots. Hello, Tom. It is Scots.
I've been
it is
there.
unbelievably Iberian. It's
I've seen the
amazing.
statue of Burns.
Oh, I
Oxford.
tell you, John Knox and all. They had the Burns lectures, for goodness sake. Now, that said, CMS played an incredible part in the dynamic that was the whole of the 20th century in New Zealand, forming missionaries, sending missionaries, terribly, terribly powerful still. Now, I would say that's waned a bit because of the whole cultural drift, can I call it? And I love Jenny's comments about society and church. It's very interesting. But CMS is still very influential. It brought across Steve Miner from Kenya as its general secretary for a while. He is now the Bishop of Nelson, Anglican Bishop of Nelson. CMS, of course, being an Anglican missionary society, still very active. I still support it. Then you've got a whole stream within the Anglican evangelical tradition in the South Island of William Orange is his name. He's now long since dead, but he fostered in the 40s and 50s a whole movement of what he called were oranges pips, you know, the pun on the fruit. And what he was doing was Bible study, Bible study, Bible study, formation of the Christian mind at a lay level. And there's still a William Orange Memorial lecture given. We have a thing called the Latimer Fellowship. I'm one of the VPs, 6 of us, you know, whatever that means. It's an interesting group that tries to straddle what is now a schism between the confessing evangelical church and the province of Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. But within that province, there is still a reaction against the gay marriage whole movement, where the General Synod has allowed a little group called the Society of St. Mark to hold to a pre-2018 definition of marriage. Whether it'll last, who knows? I have my own take on all this. So you've got a very interesting dynamic in the South Island. It spreads into the north a little bit through a movement called Affirm, which is a charismatic Anglican church orienting formation group. So yes, there's north and south, but I've concentrated, thank you, Marty, in terms of the south.
Good. And just to say that the echoing on of all these things, there is influence everywhere that is a continuation of the story. And of course, Alan Torrance was there at Knox. That's where I did my doctorate.
Correct.
And he left a mark in Murray Ray and and other people who continue to leave a Torrance tradition in the South Island in a way that's significant. So the story lives on.
And I know Laidlaw College very well. I know Otago Uni very well. I know Murray Ray. Ivor Davidson has gone back to Scotland, of course, etc., etc. I mean,
but Ivor left Mike behind. Ivor was Mike's supervisor. So again, the tradition does carry on from the story that we're talking about here today. I'm going to go back
powerfully missionary. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. The evangelical family is your second section after evangelical missions. And just to say, the family that they grew up in was a very evangelical family, and the mother was the dominant theologian at some level, is T.F. Torrance is recounting. Did you ever meet his mother? I mean, I don't.
No, I'm afraid I didn't know. I remember hearing of her passing away in her 90s, and people talking about what a remarkable, dynamic figure she was, character she was.
Yeah. Well, it's part of the story. I mean, people keep saying we need a better biography that's not just an intellectual biography of T.F. Torrance. And I think to have at least a chapter on his mother would be an appropriate addition to what's going on because of the formative nature that it appears
Right.
that is there. And you've certainly mentioned that she knew Credo enough to give it to him and to know that was a good thing. I mean,
That's fascinating, isn't it? Yes.
my mother never would have been able to do that. So
No, no, no. Now,
So
where did she get that? I'm not sure.
yeah, where did she?
Is it possible that John McConaughey in Dundee was an influence there? The Church of Scotland bookshop used to be on the ground floor, 121 George Street. Did she just find it there? Or had she seen it reviewed? I don't know. I don't know.
Well, that's a mystery for somebody to find out.
Hmm.
Somebody may know the answer to that, and maybe not. I don't know. The question of C.T. Studd. You mentioned the influence of C.T. Studd on the family. Can you say a little bit about C.T. Studd and the influence that was there?
Yes. Well,
I never connected him to the Torrances, so that was
in
new
the
for me.
1870s and 80s. Cricket was very much part of university life, particularly in Oxford and Cambridge. And Studd was famous as an international cricketer. I mean, the international cricket teams were mainly university men in those days. And when Moody held his mission at the invitation of Kikyu, Studd and 7 others were converted and publicly dedicated themselves to missions. And that launched that great movement of students, which was a completely new development. Up until that time, it had been non-university people, but there was a great wave, and Studd was the leading figure in that. Now, no one has ever written a critical biography of C.T. Studd. There seems to be some difficulty about getting hold of primary material for that.
Yeah.
But he was the leading figure in a whole movement. The Cambridge Seven, as they were called, led to a great enthusiasm. And around the same time, in the 1870s, the Keswick Convention was launched, and university students. Now, you're talking about a much smaller university population. I mean, there were only far fewer universities in England than there are now. But the students would go to Keswick, and one of the nights at Keswick was always devoted to missions. And Brian Stanley gives the statistic that I think he calculates there were something like 17,000 Protestant missionaries, evangelical missionaries, at the turn of the 20th century, so 1900, and more than half of these were British. And that was the whole movement that C.T. Studd led. Now, he went with the China Inland Mission, and then his later life was in Africa. He formed WEC, the World Evangelization Crusade, right up until the 20s and 30s.
So would T.F. Torrance have engaged him at all, or was it just his father?
I don't think that would be the case. By the time Torrance was around in the 20s and 30s, Studd was permanently pretty well in Africa. He wouldn't leave. He worked in the Congo and so on. So there would be no direct connection there. I imagine, I don't know whether his parents would ever hear Studd speak. I'm not sure about that.
Right.
But the great emphasis on consecration, which was part of the Keswick language. If Jesus Christ be God and died for me, no sacrifice I can make is too great. I'm not quoting him exactly, but there was a saying of Studd that was made a tremendous impact in that generation.
You have that in the book, I think.
Yes.
Yes. And they were very optimistic at that time that the world could be reached. The evangelization of the world in this generation was
This generation.
So,
and
I mean,
they weren't entirely wrong in this sense, that the great demographic change in world Christianity, which is dated from the 1970s, the majority in the global south
Yeah.
Europe and America now in the minority of Christian statistics. That's the fruit.
Huh.
That's the fruit of the whole 19th century missionary movement.
From those people.
Yeah.
Well, it's quite amazing. Quite amazing. The question today, you know, universities at some level, people don't want their kids to go to university because they'll lose their faith. Whereas there was something here, and again, the nature of athletes who are converted and then become, you know, a powerful voice in a sense. They've got some status by virtue of their athletic involvement, and then they become people of faith and they have a voice that makes a difference. It seems like that doesn't happen as much today. Is it partly what you just mentioned, the size of the university population? There are different attitudes maybe as well that wouldn't allow for what happened then to happen now.
I'm not familiar with the situation in the States so much,
Right?
although
Well,
that is different.
the
In the,
UK.
you have a lot of Christian colleges calling themselves universities.
Yeah.
In the British scene, InterVarsity is still very active. You will have 1,000 leaders, young leaders from Christian unions throughout the country meeting together for a conference before the university year starts, September. I mean, there are Christian unions in almost
But do they
all
ever
the
invite you?
Pardon?
Do they ever invite you?
Do
Do
they
they
what?
invite you?
Me? No, I was involved in a staff workers meeting some time ago, but I've never been, not for years in a Christian union in university, no.
Right. And this is part of generations that recognize the wisdom of previous generations and what they would bring along. I mean,
Yes,
I would think that you'd have a lot to say there.
could be.
Could be indeed. So you go on to talk in the next section about the evangelical students at Edinburgh. So at some level, Torrance was an evangelical before he ever went to Edinburgh to study, right? I mean, that just, he connected with people like Mackintosh and others who became important at Edinburgh, and the student movements that are there, which the student movements seem to have been quite powerful.
Yes.
And he already had views on the Bible of his mother. Do you think his views on the Bible changed at all?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's interesting that both David Torrance and TF may be quoted as saying that they were brought up in the family to affirm verbal revelation of Scripture.
Yeah.
Some folks today would equate that with an inerrancy position, but as Torrance makes clear, it was not an inerrancy position in the Torrance family. And indeed, that was not part of the British evangelical tradition. That was very much the Warfield North American tradition, which only began to influence British evangelicalism through Lloyd Jones in the middle of the 20th century. So people like P.T. Forsyth, James Denny, and James Orr represented the British evangelical position, which was very strongly influenced by the believing critics, as they were called, of the Free Church of Scotland in the later 20th century. So the opposition to higher criticism was not part of the tradition. The emphasis on inerrancy was not part of the tradition. And as Torrance himself says, it was the whole Bible, so it wasn't cutting out parts of the Bible, but it was a Christ-centered understanding of Scripture.
So Torrance would have affirmed Denny and Orr. They would be in a tradition.
I see him as standing in that tradition. Yes.
Right. Okay.
And you see, Mackintosh was of that tradition. So
right. So yeah, and that's going to be in the next section. But one thing, but in this evangelical student section, that's where you note these four theological positions: the liberal evangelical, the conservative evangelical, which TF you say would be in that one, and then the fundamentalists. Can you give a quick distinction on those four schools of thought and the degree to which they still are in existence?
Well, this is a very broad characterization, of course, and I'm
Sure.
always a bit suspicious of schools of thought like that, because individuals within it always have their own position. But broadly, as a help in sketching the situation, by liberal, I'm referring to the old Richian liberalism of Harnack and so on that was still influential in the 20s and 30s, but of declining influence. Now, you could also put the Bailey brothers perhaps in that, although it might be better to put them in the liberal evangelical category. It's a bit difficult to categorize the Baileys. I don't think the Baileys fit into this categorization.
Yeah.
Liberal
liberals
evangelicalism, the term
They didn't hold
actually
the Bible.
Pardon?
The liberals wouldn't hold the Bible other than with a modern kind of worldview that dissects in a sense. It had no
Yes,
implicit authority.
very true. Yes. Liberal evangelicalism was actually the title of a book published, I think it was 1923. And as I say in my chapter, they were creedally orthodox, but they looked on the inspiration of the Bible as somewhat more selectively, and it was very much God speaking to us through the Bible, but not the whole Bible. The conservative evangelicals want to say, well, the whole Bible has to be taken into account, the whole canon. And they were, of course, creedally orthodox and passionately concerned with evangelism. And then the fundamentalists would be reflecting the American influence, and it was not just verbal inspiration, but inerrancy and a certain influence of creationism, and probably some form of millennialism, premillennialism, and possibly even dispensationalism. But that was a lot weaker in the British scene than it was in the American scene, where at the popular level, it was very strong in the mid-20th century.
Do the fundamentalists still exist in the UK?
I'm sure they do. They certainly, to my mind, do not characterize intervarsity, although there may be some students, as there will be, who are associated with intervarsity, who might take that position.
Right.
But I doubt if, well, you see, in the intervarsity scene, the fundamentalism really didn't exert all that great influence. And one of the key figures here was Dr. Oliver Berkeley. Berkeley was General Secretary of InterVarsity in Scotland, in the UK in the 60s and 70s, and he was a zoologist. So he was very influential in not letting. Now, the other aspect of this, I think, is a social aspect. In the early 20th century, there was quite a strong influence of the city missions, which arose from the Moody campaigns of the 1870s. So in my native city of Glasgow, for example, there were 50, 60, 70 mission halls in the center of the city with blue-collar working class people. Now, I suspect there was a fair amount of fundamentalism there and creationism, but not in the sort of university evangelicalism of InterVarsity or the Church of England.
And so TF wouldn't have been exposed to those in Glasgow. He was in Edinburgh more.
He would be aware of that being there, yes.
And that was more working class than university.
I would guess so, yes, less educated. And of course, in those days, there was quite strong social stratification.
Todd has put a question up here for you. Could you please mention past and present Armenian and evangelicals consonant with TFT's and JB's oft-repeated phrase, a belief in the logic of the gospel, God's forgiveness precedes our repentance?
No, that's an interesting question. Possibly not. And it would vary from one tradition to another. But one of the points about Lloyd Jones and Packer was their great fascination with Puritan theology. They had an annual conference, the Westminster Conference, which met at Westminster, where Lloyd Jones was minister for so many years. That would be very much a Puritan approach. So you first preach the law, then you preach grace. Now, even after the split in which Packer and Lloyd Jones had a parting of the ways, because Packer stayed with the Church of England, of course, Lloyd Jones had this very strong non-conformist approach. Even then, I think James Packer was so immersed in the Puritans that I think he would tend to take that kind of view. And it was over against that James Torrance would influence the priority of grace.
Right. You mentioned that I think it was Lloyd Jones was with G. Campbell Morgan, who my first father-in-law called him the Prince of Preachers and loved his texts. Do you know anything about G. Campbell Morgan and his influence on any of this?
Well, Campbell Morgan was one of the great preachers of the early 20th century. And of course, Westminster Chapel was a Congregationalist church where he was pastor for decades there. And he took Lloyd Jones on in the 1930s as his assistant and successor, as was tradition in those days, when there were no retirement pensions. You carried on as a pastor until you dropped, but you took an associate and successor. And so he took Lloyd Jones there. Now, that was despite the fact that Campbell Morgan and that whole tradition of, that whole generation rather, of evangelical leaders were not Calvinist. So there was a point where Lloyd Jones, as a convinced Calvinist of the Methodist Calvinistic tradition of Wales, moved the dial somewhat in a more Calvinist direction in the mid-20th century.
Right. Well, there's all these roots to follow down, you know, who influenced who and how and where they departed. If only he had stayed with, I mean, those kind of questions. Moving on into your section on the influence of Karl Barth, which is a fairly long section. That was I put a developing direction. I mean, to say that there's something that happened, that it took something that was already an inclination in T.F. Torrance, the nature of what Mackintosh did in introducing him to Barth. Something took on a seriousness of direction at that point. Can you kind of describe what was that newness that Barth really brought through Mackintosh into where he ultimately went, supervising even the translation of the dogmatics?
Well, this is interesting, and I wonder whether a significant figure here is not P.T. Forsyth. Forsyth is sometimes called the Barthian before Barth. And he was high, although he was a Congregationalist, so he wasn't in the Presbyterian tradition. He spent most of his ministry in England and eventually became principal of Hackney Theological College, a Congregationalist college in London, dying in 1921. But he did come out of that Scottish background and that Scottish tradition. And
T.F. would have written him.
I wonder whether it was the seed sown by Forsyth, perhaps even more than Orr and Denny, that made T.F.'s mother and later Torrance himself warm to Barth's Christocentric approach. Now that's just a thesis I'm
developing.
Off the top of my head. I'd never thought about that before, but that could be the influence.
And so would T.F. Torrance have studied P.T. Forsyth's works then, or where would that
I don't,
engagement with
that's an
Forsyth have
interesting
taken
question.
place?
That would be worth looking into. I don't know the answer to that. I mean,
know
the
the
more
answer.
obvious influence is Mackintosh, of course. He's the
Yeah.
immediate influence. And it was the fact that Mackintosh was becoming interested in Bart and positive towards Bart at the very end of Mackintosh's life that influenced Torrance in that direction. And that's why he chose to go to Basel.
Yeah.
So I think that the more immediate influence was undoubtedly. So I just raised a question there that might be worth some research.
Yeah.
Is there any influence from Forsyth?
Yeah. Good. I see Bryden has his hand up there again. So what do you got for us, Bryden?
Oh, I'm intrigued, Tom. Thank you so much. P.T. Forsyth, I think, and Bart overlaps in two ways. One, the holiness of God. It's an absolute premise. And of course, that translates in a Bartian language in the terms of the glory of God, the lordship of God, if you like. Those two dynamics, the Lord who speaks, etc., etc. But also the work of Christ, P.T. Forsyth's little book.
Yes.
It's the love of the holy God that actually drives everything, I think, in my understanding of P.T. Forsyth.
Yeah.
And of course, it's the love of the Lord that drives CD2, for example. I mean, it's extraordinary how these themes anchor one. If you grab hold of them, or rather, if they grab hold of you, then there's a fascinating development all the way down the line. So that's my tuppence worth as well. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So just a little more focused on Bart and Torrance there. Bart encouraged him not to run on science, but to go with the doctrine of grace in the Apostolic Fathers. Why do you think Bart drove Torrance in that direction?
That's an interesting question. I think it may have been because of Torrance's interest already in the Fathers. But that's just a bit of a guess.
Right.
And it may have been something in which Torrance had already indicated an interest in the smaller group of a dozen that Bart invited to his home to discuss it, if possible. That's another area that would be interesting to research. But of course, Torrance's first degree was in classics and philosophy. So he would arrive at New College already highly competent in Greek and Latin.
Right. And that would be both Koine as well as Attic and
yes, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
So that it's possible that developed while he was in Basel, and so Bart suggested that. I don't know the answer to that really, but it's just a guess.
It's interesting that historically evangelicals, where I have noted them, they want you to study the Koine Greek and Hebrew because of the Bible, but they're really not interested in the languages in and of themselves. And Attic Greek is, only if it helps you with your Koine Greek.
Yes.
So it's just interesting that he had a richer dimension of language. And Latin, I don't know any Christian schools around here, at least, that still teach Latin. So I mean, there's just a devaluing of that's tragic. And Bryden's saying, that not good. It's a general loss of the intellectual tradition, right?
Yes.
And the value of what each language opens up in a sense. And to say TF, I think JB also was quite competent.
Yes, completely, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, the richness, people just think of languages as a wearying kind of task to learn them without recognizing that it opens up worlds of thought and worlds of books that are worth engaging in their original language because of the nuance and insight that is there. And even with Bart, to know the difference between Swiss German and German what difference that might make in the translation of the text. It's something that
Yeah.
only if you would know. And I don't have the ability to do that work, but I know that it's there.
The other aspect in thinking about their language facility was that, of course, they would do Latin and Greek throughout their grammar school, their secondary education.
Uh-huh.
So by the time Torrance went to New College in 34, he had been studying Latin and Greek not just for 3 years, but for probably 9 years.
Huh.
So education was much more specialized in those days. A much smaller number of people went on to education, and it was so much more thorough at that school level.
Yeah. And Torrance would have considered Bart's to be evangelical. I mean, he would have had a sense that what he understood evangelical to mean, Bart truly represented that. Is that true?
Well, here we come to this word, evangelical, and
Yes.
in my foreword to this book,
Yes.
I trace the coining of that word from Luther, from the Evangelische Kirche. So it's really the German equivalent of where we say Protestant in the English-speaking world, they say Evangelische. And in that sense, Bart was Evangelische, of course he was. In the Anglo-Saxon world, it is also shaped by the evangelical revival of the 18th century. Now, I emphasize the word revival there because, unlike Bebbington, I would want to say the evangelical movement does not begin in the 18th century with Wesley and Whitefield. It is the faith of the Reformation. And then through Puritanism in the English context, through Pietism in the German context, it comes to influence the evangelical revival of the 18th century.
Right.
So the word has a different meaning in Germany from the way it tends to be used in the UK, and it has other differences it's not much narrower, I think, in the US in the way that it's used, and it tends to be identified with revivalism, pietism, the Reformed movement, particularly the Westminster tradition, has a much narrower definition of what it is. But so would he regard Bart as an evangelical theologian? Yes, I think he would.
Yeah.
But he would also be aware of some differences.
Right. I mean, there is that from one person to the next, not to mention country to the next and all that. So, I mean, there's always room for those distinctives. I think
and of course, the word has developed in recent decades in America because of the involvement with politics. It does not have that implication whatsoever in the UK or Europe.
The dates of the founding of Christianity Today, Billy Graham's beginning his tours, and then the founding of Fuller Seminary, all I think happened in 1955. So I think it was Martin who identifies American evangelical in its current form, having those 3 points are the inception of what we would call evangelical Christianity, though one could say in the last decade or more, it has fractured significantly beyond those, and that many who call themselves evangelicals want nothing to do with Fuller. Many would say Christianity Today, never heard of it. And Billy Graham is a memory of something that their parents or their grandparents might have listened to, but that they wouldn't, other than his son comes on in the middle of football games for a short little ad and gives an altar call. So people still have the echo of the Billy Graham coming through the sun. But to say any of those are having, the same kind of impact in shaping contemporary evangelicalism, probably wouldn't be able to say that. So the nature of Bart is the Christ-centeredness, the call of the church to be rethinking its thought, not along the lines of modernism, the nature of the professors who had been, who'd all shown up on his Black Day, of going with ways of thought that all basically collapse into some form of human starting point and hence some form of natural theology. His was a clear evangelical by virtue of listening to the good news of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And so in a sense, to say the Bardian tradition of evangelical has the most clear theological root in that, whereas for others, there's a sense of we're those who are evangelists. I mean, there's the nature of the task of being of preachers and missionaries that doesn't have the same level of theological depth in a sense that you get with Bart, where the very core of who he is and what he writes has that deeper rootedness of the one who is the good news and who brings and still speaks as that good news. And we only share in what he does. We are not evangelists, except insofar as we let him speak through us. So, I mean, there's an argument to say Bart is the evangelical premier by whom others could be judged whether or not there's anything true about their wearing the name evangelical. And T.F. Torrance, by his relation to him, you'd say, well, of course he's evangelical because he maintained that tradition. Even the nature of his scientific work is the indwelling Polanyi, indwelling the person of Christ to hear and understand, and hence to speak as those who have heard, and so on.
Yes, I'm very much of the view that we need that word. We need to rescue it from the way it has been narrowed in the States.
Right.
It is a word that is defined over 5 centuries, not just since 1950s. And we need to see it in all its varieties. And I think it's quite important that we do that. I think it's much preferable to using a word like conservative, for example, which immediately sounds political because it's adopted from politics. So I think we're better to avoid the conservative word. But evangelical is a word rooted in Scripture.
Yes.
The Evangelion.
So I mean, you've written a book defining evangelicalism, or the evangelicals in the British world. So, I mean, we need more of that history brought forward, but there would need to be some sense of following in the Bart Torrance tradition to say, when I say evangelical, I mean letting the living God in the person of Jesus be the one who brings and is the good news. Something like that.
Yes, indeed.
Right.
Yes, something like that. Yes.
Which would kind of flush out a lot of the other things that want to wear the title, but for political reasons, as you're saying.
Yes.
Moving on in the handout of your chapter, Developments in British University, you kind of put the British University at the center of the process of the battling out of what ultimately came to be the shaping of the departing of the ways, and also there's a kind of an empowerment of the Torrance tradition. In the next section, when we talk about the parting of the ways, David Torrance and J.B. Torrance are two of those who show up once it's come. But university really played a critical role in the history, even for T.F. Torrance, of how he ended up where he did.
Indeed. Yes. I think you can trace that way back to the Reformation in this country, that it was university students who first got wind of Luther and what was happening on the continent. So evangelicalism has always been closely connected with universities, and the student movement of the late 19th century into varsity in the 20th century, very much still the case.
And would you say in the UK, university still leads kind of the movement of keeping the conversation of the goodness of the gospel alive?
I think that still is the case. And it's not just InterVarsity, but other Christian organizations in the university scene. And that certainly is highly influential in the shape that evangelicalism takes today in the Church of England. I think in terms of numbers, of course, the Church of England is dominant in the United Kingdom as a whole. It's much larger. England has a much larger population than Scotland. And the current strength and health and growth of evangelicalism within the Church of England is, to me, one of the most hopeful developments in the British scene.
Huh. And do any of them read T.F. Torrance?
That's an interesting question. I think the big name that would still be strongly influential among many is John Stott,
Okay.
who represents what I would call the Simeon tradition, going back to Charles Simeon at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, Vicar of Holy Trinity, Cambridge, Fellow of King's College, with a very strong emphasis on biblical preaching, expository preaching. And John Stott very much represented that. I think many will be aware of Torrance. Well, I mean, the evangelical Anglican who has most of advertised the name of Torrance, I suppose, is Alistair McGrath, who probably has published more and sold more books. The only rival I can think of would be N.T. Wright.
Right. Of course, Bryden did his PhD with McGrath. Bryden, who's right here. Bryden, who's with us there today, he did his PhD.
Yes, right, okay. And of course, it's McGrath who wrote this intellectual biography.
Yeah, intellectual biography. Yeah. Bryden mentions Chris Wright and Langham are very influential as well.
Right. Well, yes, Chris Wright and the Langham Trust, which really was Stott's foundation, very influential, and the Lausanne movement and the Cape Town Conference of 2010 and so on.
Yeah.
If I may, very quickly,
yes,
with Alistair, he actually wrote the intellectual biography of TF as preparation for his 3-volume A Scientific Theology. That's what that's actually what he told me.
Okay.
And what I find fascinating is that, of course, that 3-volume work is the undergirding of his whole reframing of natural theology. So you've got this scientist, a molecular biologist.
Yes.
That was his DPhil. And you have this engagement in this human being who is a polymath anyway. And what I find fascinating is that even now he's working in this whole area. What's one of his most recent books? Emil Brunner. So, it's still dealing with the question of natural theology, natural revelation, but recast, profoundly recast, and in a kind of a scientific theology mold, which is Torrance.
Yes.
It's fascinating, I think, to kind of try and stand back a bit and watch what this man has tried to do over the last 25 years or so. Right. There we go.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
The section on the succeeding decades also, he spent years there teaching at Edinburgh, but he also had these resistance points against Bultmann, friendships with Billy Graham, his identification and trying to contribute to the ecumenical movement, his relationship with Tom Smale and the Pentecostal charismatic movement, and the question of social action that became, at the end of that section, you talked about the engagement with social action was something some people started to distance from him a bit, but he's being shaped in these decades, right? I mean, the contours of what he was for and against really came to play in a sense in those years.
Yes, so those are the years where he's at New College, 52 to 79. And of course, when he went there, Bart was very strongly dominant, but then there came these years when Bultmann, Eristkönig, Bultmann becomes very influential. And even when I was a student at New College in the 70s, it seemed to be Torrance contra mundum, the dogmatics department against the rest.
Yes. Why was Bultmann so appealing in that context when you had Bart and Torrance right there? Why did Bultmann have such a voice?
Well, I think it's this split that runs through 19th century, the 20th century, that science is regarded as the modern thing over against the old-fashioned religion, old-time religion, and so Bultmann's demythologization strikes a chord. Because it's a generation deeply influenced by the rise of science. H.G. Wells is very influential. Humanism. It seems to be a matter of modern science versus old-fashioned religion. And so Bultmann strikes a chord at the popular level. I think that's what it is.
But isn't Bultmann a characterization, a mythologization of science, where Torrance was actually doing real science, appealing to Einstein and Polanyi? I mean,
well, I think that has to do with different levels of discourse. John Robinson's book, what's the title again?
The Death of
The
God.
Death of God, or Honest to God.
Honest to God, that's right.
There it is.
I mean, he popularizes, and people read that, and it's widely influential. Torrance is quite difficult to read when he's talking about science and theology. So I think the sort of John Robinson thing, people could immediately grasp what this was about. So dismissal of the three-decker universe and all that sort of thing. I think that was part of it. And of course, it's also the great era where the intellectual fashion is existentialism. So there again, Bultmann wins. And so Torrance finds himself running against the tide of popular culture. I think that's the point. And so a lot of the younger lecturers who were around when I was a student there were into secular Christianity, existentialism. Bart is old-fashioned.
What about Bonhoeffer?
Well, it depends which Bonhoeffer, because John Robinson used Bonhoeffer, Tillich, and Bultmann. And he really twisted Bonhoeffer. He presented a different Bonhoeffer, and of course, it's the anti-religion thing. Religiousness Christianity becomes a cry, but it's a twisted version of what Bonhoeffer was saying.
Yeah, right. So he survives those decades. Your next to the last section is called Evangelical Theology. So you're hammering this in, and the whole issue of a sharpening of biblical research. And I think you mentioned N.T. Wright and Jim Dunn and Richard Bauckham and others, that there came a point where biblical research became more important, and the interface with people like Carl Henry and the evangelical philosophers, which I think you mentioned, Plantinga and Walterstorff. There's something that lives on in the way that Bart interfaces with these. Can you just talk about who is Torrance in this era of developing of thoughtful biblical and philosophical thinkers? Newbegin you mentioned there also.
Right. Well, of course, the shape of the chapter is basically biographical, but I'm trying to look at Torrance against the background of the evangelical movement at that time. And so, whereas in that earlier part of his life, it was Forsyth and Denny and Orr and so on, who were regarded as the great evangelical names. Now, when you come into the 60s and 70s, this is what is happening in evangelical theology. So I'm trying to see Torrance against that background. How did he relate to what was generally seen as evangelicalism in those days? So, biblical research. F.F. Bruce was very influential. People were going to study with Bruce. Tyndale House had been founded, and so some real significant advance was being made in evangelical biblical studies. Carl Henry, Christianity Today, all of that in the States. Also, there's the revival, the influence of people like Wolferstorff and well, the big name, of course, is Plantinga. So that's all going on at the same time. And then there's the other phenomenon of Newbigin coming back from India, 1975, starting to publish. Now, he and Torrance are very close.
Yeah. Who influenced who more? I mean, were they mutually influencing, or what was the influence relationship there?
That's interesting. I would say it was parallel.
Okay.
A parallel influence. Newbigin read Barth when he came back from India, and so there are strong similarities there. Actually, I was introduced to Newbigin by Torrance on one occasion at a conference, and it struck me there how close they were, actually, that they were evangelical ecumenical evangelicals, both of them. And
right.
They're both into Polanyi, and so there are interesting comparisons there.
I've
And
never
then
seen anybody do anything comparing the two of them or their interrelationship.
Well, that's an interesting question. I also had a student some years ago who did a thesis on Newbigin, but I've never had anybody do a comparison of Newbigin and Torrance.
It seems like a fruitful study.
Yes.
Yes. Matthew, I see that hand up there.
Yeah, just quick. When I was in Edinburgh a few years ago, I was at one of Bob Walker's studies he does, and I asked him about this question because there are striking parallels, you know, and the way they think. And he told me that Uncle Tom sat down with Leslie Newbigin one time and set him straight or something like that. I thought that was really fun to hear. But he, you know, he made him. He indicated some asymmetry there, you know. But you know, that's fun. So anyway, but you can see that.
Yes.
Newbigin did write a book against John McMurray, so I have to deal with that at some point.
Oh, right. Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yes. So I'll deal with that as we go along.
Right. Well, then finally in that section, I have a brief survey of evangelical systematics in that era. Blush, Wainwright, Oden, Grant, Erickson, Grudem, Gunton, Webster, McGrath, representing different schools of evangelical theology, some closer to Torrance, some further away.
Right. And we don't have time to go in all of those, but they're all generally evangelical who are furthering the tradition with different distinctives in a sense.
Yes.
So your final section, Torrance as evangelical theologian. Again, this is in a sense a whole study of T.F. Torrance, the person, to deal, you know, with his origins and what you're calling the beginning of evangelical, going back to Calvin,
Yes,
or beyond, to say maybe Athanasius is the beginning of evangelical theology, right?
Yes.
I mean, you could argue that.
Well,
theology is evangelical.
In my chapter in the T&T Clark Handbook on T.F. Torrance, which was an incarnation of atonement, I argue that Torrance came out of the Denny, Forsyth Scottish tradition with its focus on the cross, its Christ-centeredness, Christ crucified, but that through his study of the fathers, he deepened that by exploring more deeply than any of them did. The doctrine of Christ, the incarnation. So it's the union of Christology and soteriology in Torrance. So I think he takes that Scottish tradition and he shows it that it has a much deeper basis in the fathers, which generally they were not particularly aware of. Although that's unfair on Orr, because he did write the Progress of Dogma, of course, where he where he
Yeah.
did look at the patristic tradition.
Yeah.
But Torrance used to talk about how those two are complementary. What the reformers give us, what the fathers give us. So the reformers are strong on the atonement on the cross. The fathers are strong on the incarnation, the person of Christ. So in one you have the acts of God in his being, in the other you have the being of God in his acts. And he used to talk about how complementary those two are, the fathers and the reformers. So in that way, yes, I see him as an evangelical theologian, but as one who draws evangelical, who emphasizes that evangelical faith does not begin with the Reformation, that it has to be seen to be rooted back in the fathers.
Yeah. Yeah, which makes him unique in helping to define going forward what evangelical might mean, and then the necessity of the point that you just made for the whole picture. And the value of the creeds, to say, you know, we don't throw those out. We it's not just a matter of reciting them and not believing them, but there is something of the depth of clarity of living within and being able to articulate the nature of the good news that is resident within the creeds.
I mean, I think it is a reasonable criticism of evangelical theology that it tends to think that theology begins with the Reformation.
Right.
It fails to grasp the depths of the basis in the creed, in the Trinity, in the incarnation. Tony Lane has done interesting work on how Calvin is actually, of all the reformers, the one who is most based on the fathers. And I think Torrance was very much aware of that evangelical faith has to see that you go back, you press back beyond the Reformation. You have to go back to the fathers.
Yeah. So a much broader picture there. Again, just the whole nature of the way he stayed between tritheism and social Trinitarianism, the full-bodied personalizing personhood of God. The phrase the evangelical Trinity, to say that the Trinity is not just a doctrine that one confesses, but it's a whole life that is lived towards us, in which we participate, which is bringing the evangelical word into a dynamic way of being in God and towards us all together, in a sense.
Of course, that is his phrase for the economic Trinity. He prefers to speak about the evangelical Trinity, in other words, the Trinity of the gospel. So he's using the word more in the biblical sense there than in reference to a modern Christian tradition.
But the nature of that reading of it also takes you into the ontological. I mean, the very being of God is the God who comes to us. And so, in a sense, you could say that it brings them together nicely in a way that doesn't use the words. I mean, because they say economic, people start thinking money, and that this brings in personal engagement in a sense. So, and again, his whole use of the reformers constructively, rather than just throwing Calvin out like many do, he uses them collectively, and then to be shaped by the whole nature of the sciences, Einstein, Polanyi. I would throw McMurray in there as another person who is part of a philosophical scientific way of thinking. Ultimately, you end with this vision of a life of evangelical faithfulness, that the nature of who he is, the life that he lived, as well as the words that he left, represents, maybe to say, his relationship to evangelicalism, that he lived it in a faithful way.
Yes, indeed. And at the end, of course, I refer to these 2 trips back to China to visit the fellowships, the churches that his father had founded, and to travel with that belt with the gold coins round his waist at the age of 80 by bus up into the hills, and to find those fellowships and to help them to rebuild their churches.
He returned 10 years later at the age of 80 with money to rebuild the church buildings and finance theological education for pastors. Nothing could more vividly illustrate his lifelong commitment to mission, to the preaching of the gospel, and to evangelical faith in Christ. That's your final sentence in your chapter. Well, Tom, it's late in your neck of the woods, so we're grateful for you staying up. Is it 11 o'clock there now?
It is indeed. 2
It
minutes.
is
to
almost 11. So yes. And Jenny, what time is it in Australia?
I think that God is now awake in Australia at 7:30 in the morning here.
7:30 in the morning, and Brian, you're a little bit past that. So we're indeed embracing the world with the evangelical good news of who Jesus is to us and what he's done through T.F. Torrance. So Tom, thank you for your great writing of a chapter, your willingness to be with us today to just further engage and prepare people to read this chapter when the book comes out just in a few weeks. I think it releases the 17th of May is the release date.
Oh, does it? Right. Good.
In the
Good.
States.
Well, maybe
I
I'll
think
get my copy
Lexham
then.
and Amazon. Well, you should get your copy before then. Jenny, you have your copy, right?
Yeah, mine only arrived just this week. It takes
Ah.
quite a while to come from the publishers. There was some available from Amazon, but I'm not sure if there still are.
Yeah.
So it's sneaking out here and there, I think, depending on where
So-
you order it.
Yeah,
Right,
I don't know if the world turns faster, if things have a harder time fighting against the wind going one way or the other to get to you or not, but
Well, I'm looking forward to reading these other chapters, including yours.
yes,
Thank you
very
very
good.
much, Tom.
Good. Well, thank you all for being here today and blessing us with your presence, your questions, your comments. There was so much we couldn't get to, but I think everyone was also very engaged with those as well. So thanks for being a great community of support. Blessings
Thank
on you,
you.
Tom, and all.
Bye all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.